I wanted to start off very quickly by saying why I made The Angry Heart, the film in the first place, which came out in 2001. The subject of The Angry Heart, we're going to be seeing some clips here in a minute. Subject of The Angry Heart, Keith Hartgrove, Elmer certainly, well, all of us know, was a good friend of mine. He had worked with me, he did camera work with me, he was someone that I hired as a freelancer on a pretty regular basis. One time we were doing a job in New York City, and we had finished, and we were in a very high-class hotel in New York, and we decided to have a little lunch before getting in the van and driving all the equipment back to Boston. And I was a few steps behind Keith as he walked into this fancy restaurant in the hotel, and sadly I got to experience a racial incident. The people in the restaurant it was as if he was invisible. Nobody saw him, nobody paid any attention to him. And by the way, Keith is always a significantly better dresser than me. I'm usually in jeans, and and he's always looks much nicer. And if I were to think anybody was going to spend money in the restaurant, I would bank on him rather than me. But anyway, I got very upset at that moment seeing this, and especially the fact that he was my friend. And I made my feelings very plain to the people in the restaurant, and we left and ended up eating someplace else. And on that long drive back to Boston after we'd eaten, our friendship reached a different level. We became much closer friends. And then when I heard that Keith had had a heart attack, I knew that I had to document it. I had to talk about his story. I had to talk about this problem that I was seeing and that a lot of people were seeing, but very few people were talking about, when I started shooting in 1998. So that's why I made the Angry Heart, which is Keith's story, and his story is interwoven with experts talking about the larger picture. So I always try and talk about the individual, and I try and talk about the big picture at the same time. So we'll see some clips from The Angry Heart tonight, and the panel is going to discuss those clips and kind of talk about where we were then, where we are today. Some things have improved, some things have gotten worse. My goal is to make a second film now called Healing the Angry Heart, where I'm going to focus on 3 or 4 different individuals to tell their stories in a similar fashion. And I want the focus to be on healing and what people are doing post-heart attack, post-problems, how they manage to get through this and come out on the other side. That's a longer introduction than I wanted to give, but I want to introduce Paula Parnagian, a great friend of mine, and she'll do a terrific job moderating this. Paula, why don't you go ahead and begin.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening, Paula.
It's great to see you all here. It's very exciting. I saw The Angry Heart almost exactly 10 years ago because Paul Marcus, who I'll introduce in a moment, had a showing of it through his organization, Community Change. And I had been doing diversity work for quite a while, but this was the first time I had seen this topic, health disparities, covered to such an extent that I was blown away by the video and felt very moved and compelled that, man, we got to do something about this. So I went up to Paul afterwards and said, why don't we do something? He said, okay, let's do something. So we put a task force together, and we did a very powerful program to take this issue and present it to the Boston medical community, healthcare medical community, and it was very successful. And then several years later, Jay and Carolyn, Jay's wife, Carolyn, they had twin baby boys, and I was over there constantly holding those boys. And Jay said, you know, I'd really like to do something in the community. And I said, okay, let's do that. So then we got Elmer involved and Michael James involved, and we did, again, a very powerful program. One of the most moving things I think I've ever been involved with. So I'm thrilled to be up here with Paul and Elmer and to help moderate tonight's discussion. I'd like to introduce Paul and Elmer. So first, let's talk about Elmer. Elmer is Executive Director of the Center for Community Health Education, Research, and Service, otherwise known as CCHERS, and is an adjunct assistant professor and director of urban health programs and policy for the Bouvé College of Health Sciences at Northeastern. Prior to this, Mr. Freeman was executive director of the Whittier Street Health Center in Roxbury for 17 years. Paul is executive director of Community Change. Paul is a white, anti-racist activist, educator, and consultant who works to understand and challenge the role white people play in perpetuating and maintaining white supremacy, racism, and white privilege. He taught the history of racism in the United States of America at Boston College for many years. So welcome, Paul and Elmer, and I'm looking forward to the conversation we're going to have tonight. So before we have that conversation, Jay's put together about 8 minutes of different clips from the video, The Angry Heart. You will meet Keith in the video if you haven't seen it, and you will also meet a number of specialists in the topic of health disparities. They are all either MDs or PhDs, clinicians or researchers in the field, and nationally and internationally known for their work and have been working on this for decades. So let's take a look at the video, and then we'll have a panel discussion, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Because of the color of my skin, everybody knows when they see me what I am, or at least they think they know what I am, based on my skin color, and not the content of my intellect, the content of my kindness, or the person that I am is not really based on what's on the outside. And because of what's on the outside, most people shut themselves off to what's on the inside. That's something that I've had to deal with for 44 years. I expect it. I don't accept it, but I expect it.
We can do things like embody inequality, literally bring into our bodies exposures to toxic substances, to hazardous conditions, or to interpersonal stressors. We can embody those aspects of inequality, or conversely, embody those aspects of privilege, and then end up with biological manifestations, biologic expressions, as it were, in this case of race relations. So that while there may not be innate fundamental differences between, say, African Americans and whites, there may be still biologic differences that are acquired because of the fact of living in a racist society.
Stress plays a very important role in all of our lives, and certainly when you're in a social environment that causes you to sort of be on guard much of your time. Has it been measured? It probably hasn't been quantitated to the extent that it would be recognized in wide scientific circles. But certainly anyone who lives in America and has gotten to age 15 or 20 or 30 can give you countless numbers of incidents that have been both subtle and overt. So the mind and body are connected, and it would be hard to say that people would not be internalizing some of the stress that they encounter in their workaday lives, in their social lives, in just about everything that they do.
It's hard for me to admit racism has diminished me. I want to be strong. I want to be able to stand up to the test and say, oh yeah, I've weathered the storm and I've come out and I'm, you know, some kind of hero or something. I don't see myself that way. I see myself as beaten down, but not overcome. I've had my bout with it. I've dealt with it to the best of my ability, but I'm weathered, you know. Like a rock that, you know, sits by the shore. every time it gets hit by a wave, you know, it's a little bit less than it was before. That's how I feel.
The African American experience in the health system in many ways has paralleled our citizenship status. And as we know, we really did not get the voting rights until the mid to late 1960s. And it was during that same period of time that the healthcare facilities in the United States were desegregated by law. So prior to that, it was a completely segregated health system, and it really wasn't until the late 1960s that African Americans began to get even access to the lower tiers of the multi-tiered system in the United States, and that tiering exists today.
Basically beginning probably around 11 years ago, that was when the first data, the first really good data started coming out about these disparities in treatment. And the first studies were really done on administrative data. And what I mean by that are kind of chart review type of data you can get from, you know, files that Medicare uses. And what we've seen over those kind of ensuing 10 years are more and more data, including my own, that really show that African Americans are diagnosed less frequently when they have signs and symptoms that really point towards heart disease. There was a study published that looked at scenarios in which actors basically presented all with the same symptoms. So they basically gave the same history, talked about having the same symptoms, etc. And physicians who viewed these videos were far less likely to refer African American patients for further testing. And that was even, the disparity once again was greatest for African American women.
Racism is alive and well and kicking and hurting. It exists, and that's the biggest hurdle for white folks to understand. Part of it is because white folks, by virtue of their whiteness, and they don't have to do anything else, are benefiting from a racist system. Many doors that say close to me open up when the white person approaches, and they don't even realize there was a door there. It's not only that the door is opening, they don't even know that there was a door. That's the biggest hurdle, is understanding that racism is alive and well and exists in this country. It's affecting people adversely. It's affecting the whole nation.
Even in this world where there's a lot of oppression, there's some things that I can take on and do for myself and my community and my family that will reduce my likelihood of dying of cancer, reduce my likelihood of dying of cardiovascular disease. And I'm not sure that in a community-wide way we've accomplished that, to simply say racism is a given. It's not just you, it's not just your individual behavior, it's racism is a given. But within that context, there's some things you can do. I think that's liberating for folks because they recognize that there's some system changes that have to come about, but that those system changes shouldn't limit their desire to get knowledge, their desire to get information, their desires to improve their community so that it's a place that they can exercise and live in healthy.
Keith Hartgrove, young brother, suffered a very critical heart attack, and the Lord brought him back. Amen. And our solos do none other than Brother Keith Hartgrove.
So let's start by talking about where you think we're at 10 years later in terms of the changes that and progress that have occurred and those that have not occurred in the last 10 years. And Elmer, why don't we start with you and then we'll go to Paul.
Well, one of the things that has changed is that people have begun to accept Nancy Krieger's theory about embodying inequality, that the issues of racism and discrimination and the impact that it has on oppressed groups in our society actually do manifest themselves in health outcomes and the like. So when Vanessa, and I have to confess, I feel so old looking at this because I know all of the experts in this were mentees of mine at some point or another. Nancy looks extremely young here. And we actually just finished a major 5-year study with Nancy Krieger at the Harvard School of Public Health, which is where she's based. And we used our network of community health centers. And we actually, as academics, any academics in the audience would appreciate, we actually published our first article in December of 2011. And it looked at 500 native-born whites and 500 native-born blacks in community health centers: Geiger Gibson, Roxbury Comprehensive Health Center, Mattapan Community Health Center, Whittier Street, Dimmock, and a number, Southern Jamaica Plain, in the city of Boston. And and testing cortisol levels, which are a hormone that rises like adrenaline. So the whole notion of fight or flight. When you're confronted with an issue, your adrenaline speeds up and you decide whether to fight or flight. And Keith's response has always been, or has been for the most part, a flight kind of response. I've seen this film many, many times, and there's a section in it which his mother says that she taught Keith that you just have to let these things roll off your back and keep on moving ahead. It's going to be times when people are going to express things to you with these things that we call microaggressions. When you get on an elevator and see a woman grab a pocketbook because a black man has entered the elevator and the like. So there's some of the science is beginning to happen. In February 2011, the National Institutes of Health actually had a 2-day conference on the relationship between discrimination and health outcomes. And many scientists were there presenting their theories and the like and outcomes of their research. So I think that, we don't have to make the case as strong as we did in 2001, that the case has been made by the scientists, that the evidence is there. And the question is, as the Institute of Medicine report says, not in debating whether or not, these disparities and inequities in healthcare actually exist, but we really need to focus on how do we address them and start to move forward.
Thank you, Elmer. Paul?
I don't have a lot to add to that. I think the issue is that there has been, the one place there's been progress is a lot of the things that they were talking about have been confirmed through multiple studies. The issues about stress. And it's interesting because oftentimes in conversations about racism in healthcare, we think it's about lack of insurance, and it is, it's on some level. We think it's about cross-cultural competency within doctors, and that's a reality there. But it's a much larger issue, and there's a number of things we could list along that, but it's a much larger issue than all of those things. And so when we talk about the stress of living in a racist system and dealing with that every day, Elmer talked about microaggressions. And as a white person, I have plenty of stress in my life, but one of the privileges I have in my life is I don't face stress on a daily basis because of the color of my skin. And I think that there's not, and when we talk about issues of systemic racism, there's not a lot of places I say we need some more studies. I think this is an area where studies are helpful, like in housing and things like that. We have plenty of data. It's like we have enough data. Let's do something about it. So
good. Okay, Paul, why don't you lead off on this question? How do you think we're doing in terms of educating folks on these issues? So I'll ask you to talk a little bit about community work, and Elmer, if you could talk about the medical and healthcare communities.
Well, from my perspective, and the perspective of the work we do at Community Change, we can't challenge something we don't know exists. And so I listen to conversations a lot about race and racism, and oftentimes on some of the national call-in shows on NPR, they'll be talking about race and racism, and it's very clear to me, and it's very clear to me whenever we do a workshop on race and racism that there's 20 different understandings of what racism is in the room. And so everybody's using the same word, but we mean different things, and we can't even have that conversation. And the vast majority of people understand racism, and I've asked this question to about 20,000 people over the last 22 years, so I think I have some pretty good anecdotal evidence. The vast majority of people understand racism as something that individuals do, think, or feel. They might define racism as prejudice and discrimination based on race. When I'm talking about racism, and I know when Elmer's talking about racism, we're talking about something very different. If someone asks me what racism is, the ism place is the first place I go. We're talking about a system. And we're talking about a system that's created when one group has the power, systemic power, to institutionalize its prejudices and its beliefs and values. And so that then becomes laws, policies, practices, and procedures, and shapes the culture we live in, and from a national level to a state level to all of the institutions that we swim in. And so if having that understanding of racism has a very different consequences for the way we think about solutions to these problems. If I think it's about individual things people do, feel, or act on or discriminate on, I have a very different understanding and a different solution in terms of thinking about how to deal with this problem. So from my perspective, one of the biggest pieces is to get people to see this. We actually use the analogy of the film The Matrix. And for people, for people seeing this, it's like taking the red pill, and it's and moving from an individual internal understanding of racism to a systemic understanding of racism is transformational for people. So that's a big first step, is just having the tools to see it.
Okay, good. Thank you, Paul. Elmer?
You know, and that sort of remains the challenge for even the medical community. I sort of want to respond by just giving an example. I was invited to an event at Harvard that was focused on trying to increase the number of blacks that participate in clinical trials. You know, I mean, and given the history and the legacy of research in black communities and what have you, but I'm a strong believer that we need to have research. We need to have research that's community focused, that's, you know, that's diverse in terms of participants and the like. And just to show you how ingrained and insidious some of this stuff is, Linda Clayton, who was also in the film, who was talking about the segregated hospitals up until the 1960s. Linda was there. She was on the faculty of Harvard School of Public Health. I was there, and so Linda's sitting on the other side of Paul. Sitting in Paul, instead of a white man, is a white woman, internationally renowned cardiologist, and here I sit here. And as she was explaining one of the difficulties of getting people, black people, into a trial, she was trying to bring a drug to market. A cardiologist saw a cardiac drug, you know, heart issues and what have you. And as she described it, she says, well, you know, I have a challenge because I'm looking at, you know, how this drug affects heart rates and what have you. And given the different genetic makeup of black people, it's very difficult to recruit them. And I sort of like looked, you know, because we all know with 99.9% of the genes are the same and everybody's the same on the skin and all that good stuff. And I learned many years ago, running the community health, that I needed white coats to talk to white coats. So as I looked, and I looked past her to Linda, like, well, you're the doctor, so like, what's the response here? So Linda goes through her thing, oh, well, we know it's not genetics. You know, we're all the same, and this, that, and the other. But by 5 minutes later into the conversation, she talked about the physiological differences, and there are physiological differences. You know, people metabolize insulin differently in terms of treating their diabetes and the like. And for whatever reason, I don't know quite why, but I got my suspicions, but I'm not a scientist, I'm not a researcher, nor do I want to be. But for whatever reason, physiologically, black women's heart beats more times per minute than any other group in our society. Now, I don't know what that's about, but it was validated by the other physicians, many of them black in the room, so I accept it as, you know, as evidence and what have you. But the notion that here is the international cardiologist that can sit in a room full of people and say that we're genetically different, you know, shows how ingrained it was in her mind, how spontaneous that result was, you know, which later she explained as physiology, which we all could understand relative to it. So, you know, so we have curriculums in medical schools, health professional schools that look at cultural competency. You know, I've walked away from cultural competency, you know, cultural congruence, cultural humility. So that for me, the definition or the action is to be able to put yourself in the other person's position all right, and have some humility relative to that to sort of be in a position to empathize and therefore be able to like relate to the person that's in front of you. You know, the other thing is we're really going to have an impact on health inequities. We really need to have a healthcare workforce that starts to look like the diversity of our society ultimately. So I don't want to get into conversations about opportunities and achievement gaps in education, you know, and where people end up and how certain people end up in certain professions, what have you.
Okay, good. Keith talked about being worn down and being, I think he said something like being a rock by the shore.
The weathering.
Yeah.
The weathering theory.
Yeah, could you both talk to that a little bit?
The weathering theory talks about being a rock on the shore, and every time a wave hits it, it's less than it was. It may take a while for that erosion to happen and sort of reshape and reform that rock. But ultimately, that's what the weathering theory is, that you have these microaggressions, you have these, you know, incidents that start to build up and have an impact, that start to, you know, manifest themselves in levels of stress. They start to manifest themselves in behaviors. You know, some people try to cope with certain kinds of things with substances that sort of relieve it and what have you. So that's really what he was talking about when he talks about the weathering process, the weathering theory.
Mm. Paul, do you want to add to that?
Well, I just think it's not my place to talk about the black experience, but I know a lot about the white experience. And so I think I could talk about my life as the sedimentary theory.
Okay.
So, you know, a question we've asked a lot to people in workshop settings and in classes is, what's your relationship to race? And the vast majority of the white people begin having that conversation, and it's about their connection with a person of color and their earliest memories of that. And the part of the transformation through this process of moving from an individual understanding to a systemic understanding for me has been, I go back to when I was a little kid, and I grew up in East Hartford, Connecticut, in a working class family, and I'm sitting in my living room on a Friday night with a box of potato chips watching, I think, the Flintstones, and Rawhide, I think, was on Friday nights, or 77 Sunset Strip. I'm dating myself, and I was feeling pretty comfortable. And I would go outside, and people would treat me in a certain way, and I was getting messages all of my life that were telling me all kinds of messages through the media, through family, through school, through the curricula that I was teaching, that was telling me that I was better in that I've internalized that at some level. And I think for all of us, we all internalize it. And you know, whites internalize superiority, and people of color can internalize inferiority. And so that's part of what we're dealing with. So I think we have to, you know, when we talk about, we often talk about, and I hear people talking about underprivilege, but we never talk about the flip side of underprivilege, because if there's underprivilege, there must be overprivilege.
Mm-hmm. So Paul, you just brought up the notion of class and how that impacts the relationship on these things. I know when I first started looking at this topic, you know, I assumed that poverty was sort of the difference, but you know, as time has gone on, I've learned that really poverty impacts it, but it doesn't, it's not the same as the impact of racism.
It's not. You know, first of all, I don't think we can understand this without a historical context. So I'm going to go back to Virginia in the 1600s, because that's when race gets created. Ultimately, the way we understand race today is a relatively new concept. And so what we have is the elite planning class who is concerned because white indentured servants are becoming free, and they've also formed coalitions with people, with Africans and with Native Americans, and threatened the power structure. And very clearly, they created institutions and laws and policies, and you can see this through legal decisions and legislative decisions, that said to white people that you have more in connection with us than the people who you really have more in connection with. And so we have this wedge that's been built, and so that what happens is the poor working class white people get used to hold down the Africans and the enslaved Africans. And that's built within a system. This is the same time capitalism is forming. So we have that history, and so I'm going to take that up to the present, and I'll take it up to 2010 when the Kirwan Institute at Ohio State did a study in Massachusetts. They do something called opportunity mapping, and this is Massachusetts, January 1st, 2010. 94% of African Americans in Massachusetts live in low opportunity communities. The interesting statistic for me was while 98% of low-income African Americans live in low-opportunity communities, only 33% of low-income whites live in low-opportunity communities, which means that if I'm a low-income white, I have a much better probability of being in a community that has better schools, better health care, more access to jobs, more access to all of those things that increase my life chances, and at some level, it decreased the stress in my life.
Okay. Elmer?
So relative to socioeconomic status and class, I mean, they've adjusted for those things, and it doesn't really matter relative to socioeconomic status. One of the other things, or the other documentaries that came out that we used to use in terms of education was called Unnatural Causes, which showed that a upper middle class black woman in Atlanta, lawyer type, making close to 7 figures. When she became pregnant, she still had a low birth weight baby that was in jeopardy of dying, with the infant mortality rates among blacks being 4 to 5 times higher than they are for whites and what have you. So it really doesn't matter relative to poverty. It's what Keith said. It's what you see in front of you as to how you ultimately act. When I do my presentations, when I talk about unequal treatment, I make an analogy between when Massachusetts went through car insurance reform and currently going through health insurance reform. Amica came into the market and their commercial was, it's not how you covered, it's how you're treated. Well, the same thing relative to this. It doesn't matter if you're making more money, if you're well insured, it's how you're treated, and based on what the person sees in front of them, they make various kinds of assumptions and the like. Many of these studies, like the Institute of Medicine Unequal Treatment Report, have been replicated, was actually replicated here in Boston at Mass General Hospital, where people presented at the emergency room with same symptomology, same history, and what have you. And the treatment that whites would receive in terms of access to painkillers, for instance, was different than what blacks and Latinos would receive, making assumptions that they were abusers and this, that, and the like.
I'd like to say one more thing about that. So the reason I went back to the 1600s is because the construction of race and the beginnings of capitalism in this country are happening all at the same time. So they're very much intertwined. So at one level, we have to understand that interconnection of race and class and gender and all of it. But we have to understand those interconnections and also understand that there are those differences. And that's a very complicated piece. So there's a lot of impoverished white people suffering in this country too, and we have to have an answer for them, because the answer that I've been talking about, the answer has been this wedge that's been driven in, and so that what we really have is we have white, working class, middle class white people voting against their own interests because of racism, and so I think we need to be, and that's happening if you follow the healthcare reform. And there's no question, and when we're talking about racism, and when I talk about the racism that's coming around for the Tea Party, I'm not talking about the obvious, like the bone and the president's head or the watermelons on the front lawn. That's the easy stuff to see. But if you ask people, talk about, we want to take back America. Well, where do they want to take America back to? And most of the people in this room are old enough to remember what America was like with the time they want to take it back to, which is the late 50s. And at that time, big government was working really well for people who look like me. And I think that, and I just want to take a minute to talk about that, because I think it's essential, because when we're talking about systemic racism, we're talking about all of these interconnections. So we have to ask that question, where do you live, why do you live there, and what does your community look like? And when we start looking at housing policy in this country, we can see that it was federal FHA policies between 1933 and 1964, $120 billion in housing subsidies in housing. 98.6% of that went to white people. It built the suburbs. At the same time, urban renewal's happening. Federal highways are being built. It makes it easier for people to get out of cities and out into the suburbs that are being built. And so all of that's happening. At the same time, whites are being subsidized in the accumulation of wealth while blacks are being divested. And tax bases, jobs, and all of those things leave the cities. And so that impoverished urban communities didn't just happen, that there are structural realities for that. And then if you're living in that structural reality, you have less opportunity to get a good education. You have less opportunity to get good prenatal care, so it starts before you're born. You have less opportunity to get a good education. That impacts your ability to get a job. That impacts your ability to get health insurance. And so we have this interconnected web of institutions. And we can look at every single institution and see how it's affecting those communities in detrimental ways.
Well, that reminds me of what's happening in education. Some of us in the room, including myself, have been deeply immersed in what's happening with education reform. And there's a tremendous amount of resources being spent on solutions to closing the achievement gap. So I'm wondering if in your work, Elmer and Paul, if you see that, you know, headway is being made, and/or do you feel that they're still sort of missing the point and misdirecting precious resources?
The achievement gap is, to me, growing worse because unfortunately we're tying everything to this high stakes test. The stress levels that these kids have, you know, in 4th grade, in 2 weeks I gotta take the math MCAS. I mean, in the 4th grade.
So the cortisol
and it's not
levels
demonstrated. Their cortisol
getting
levels
elevated
already
early.
and stressed and what have you, exactly.
Yeah.
And you know, just the way we frame the issue, we talk about an achievement gap rather than an opportunity gap, and that has meaning. You know, achievement gap is passive, and it says it lays it on the blame of the people who aren't achieving, as opposed to having a systemic understanding of that. I don't, you know, in terms of healthcare, there are some pockets around the. There's things happening nationally, and I don't, you know, I'm not an expert on healthcare, but I do know that there's some communities that have made some really great gains. But I see things getting. I hate to say it, and I'm actually an optimist by nature, but I think things getting worse. You know, we know there's another thing that's been done since the film was made is there's a lot of research that looks at inequality, and we know that the wider the inequality in a country, the greater incidence of poor health care, greater incidence of poor mental health, of drug abuse, of teen pregnancy, of violence, and all of those things. And in fact, in this country, we know if you look at the 50 states, and you see differences based on the inequality differential within the states. And so we know that's happening. And so we know the impact of inequality, and we also know the direction. I think that where the country's been heading for the last, I would say, 20 or 30 years. So we know the impact of what's happening, and so health care is not good health. The way in the system that we have right now, health care happens when you get sick, and so we could do more by narrowing the gap in inequality in this country. For healthcare outcomes than we could by a lot of the things that we've been talking about tonight, and that's widening. You know, there's a film we use a lot called "Race: The Power of an Illusion," and they really do a great job looking at the FHA policy that I was talking about, and that leads to when that film was made in 2003, the wealth gap, the net worth gap between blacks and whites was 8 times. Whites had 8 times the net worth of blacks on average. Today, 10 years later, it's 20 times. And so we have to be, and we know what's happening in terms of inequality, wealth inequality in this country.
Okay, good, thank you. Okay, let's open it up. And I'll ask you if you have a question or a comment to please keep it to 1 minute.
My name is Gonja Sonmes Pool. Thank you, that was wonderful. But I am gonna, without criticizing what we're discussing in the panel, I do wanna kind of bring it back to what the discussion was and about, what it's really called, because honestly, I don't think anybody in this room thinks that America is not racist. I mean, I think we are very well aware. I am. But I'm just wondering in terms of, what the film is about, I would have liked a little bit of discussion about what are some of the tools that can be given to African Americans in the healthcare industry so that they are not discriminated. And I'm not in any way saying, well, they should do something about it. I'm just saying in all of this whole, industry, are there some tools? Because there's gotta be. If somebody walks into a doctor's office and the doctor is basically like, well, it's like, with women, they say, well, you're not, it's in your head or whatever. That kind of, that's also race. I mean, it's prejudicial. Are there some things that are being done is what I'm asking. I'd like to have more comments about what the film is about rather than basically saying to ourselves, yes, there's racism, because I think we all know.
Well, I think there are clear attempts within the medical care system, and I say medical care system because we don't have a healthcare system, and that's one of the challenges. But there are many attempts in the medical care system to sensitize mainly physicians for the most part. And even that to me is sort of a misplacement of effort, because physicians are actually insignificant to people's health. You know, it's been demonstrated, you know, probably about 10%, you know, of health outcomes are really dependent on medical interventions and the like, and other things, mostly around environment, you know, the place where you grow up. You know, the Public Health Commission has a whole thing on know your zip code, because your zip code is probably more important than your genetic code when it comes to your health and what have you. So I'll use the example of one that's local. The Disparity Solutions Center at Mass General Hospital is headed up by Joe Bentoncourt. Really goes around the country trying to educate physicians relative to their sensitivities relative to race and how they see themselves. So there are all kinds of vignettes, you know, like the ones in the Institute of Medicine report that they use in medical education to get people to think broader than what they just see in front of their face and have a different kind of response. But they're few and far between, because the bottom line, you know, one thing that John Rich says in the film that he didn't say in this particular clip is that we're all socialized in a system of racism. And it's very hard to sort of undo yourself from that harness, if you will. And then we need to recognize that. So there has to be effort to recognize that it's happening, and how do you get past it, you know, and be more sensitized to it. So there are efforts being done.
Michael, you've been working on this issue in your community. Do you have any thoughts about things that are happening where people are taking steps to address some of these things for themselves?
I think there are efforts being taken to address these issues, and a lot of it is a lack of education. And often people have different learning styles, and that often isn't considered. We go and try to do a broadband approach rather than cater it to the specific ways that those particular communities respond to best. And so I've seen some progress, but it's not unified. So one neighborhood may put on some type of event, like we've put on different events in the Dorchester area to sort of educate everyone about, you know, all the issues they can address by just visiting their doctors on a consistent basis. And at the same time, in another neighborhood, that conversation is never happening, but we're only like a block away. So there's so many, this is such a broad subject, but I think if we started early in the schools, teaching the kids about how they actually manage their health, that's at least a first step. I think overall there is progress, as I stated, but I do feel that if we don't start addressing it soon in a unified way, we're going to start to regress.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Thank you, Michael. This gentleman next to you, Michael. Alex?
I think, going back to your question, I think it's really hard to tease out the situations that people live in, you know, because sometimes people are living in a situation because of the color of their skin. This summer, I worked on an evaluation of the summer jobs program in Boston. We hired 6 they were in-school truants, young people. They were going back for a 5th year at the Jeremiah Burke. These children were bright, wonderful kids. They all had symptoms, not able to sleep at night. This was PTSD. We, in fact, brought in a clinician, to work with them. But the fact of the matter is, I sat with the Boston homicide map, drew a half-mile radius around the Burke, 37 homicides within a 15-minute walk of that school in the 4 years that they were there. A nurse at Upper Corner said, Boston's emergency service is really great. You can multiply that by 2 or even 3 for the violent incidents. And some of the kids are in-school truants because they're afraid to go home, but they come to school They're late to school because they're scared to go out of the house. I mean, it's just an impossible situation. The interesting thing about these, of the 6, 3 were immigrants, but they were all immigrants who looked African American. So I was really struck by this. I haven't worked in that community for a long time, and it was a real revelation that things are not better. They're worse than they were 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, there's the old adage, there's the old story about babies are floating down a river, and there's a bunch of people spend a lot of time pulling the babies out, but nobody took the time to go down and figure out why they're getting thrown in the first place. And so there's a lot of things. So, you know, that's, I think a lot of the things that education is really important, but there are these individual solutions to systemic problems, but we have to keep the focus on the whole system. And you know, I don't want to sound like Debbie Downer, but there is the reality that we need systemic solutions for systemic problems.
You know, I had a very telling experience. Last Saturday, actually, I took a group of freshman stars from Northeastern University on a tour of, you know, community health. And one of the things that, based on where Northeastern is, we were going down the Southwest Corridor, so I talked about the history of the Southwest Corridor and all the new things out there, you know, Roxbury Community College, the police headquarters, the Reggie Lewis track, Whittier Street Health Center's brand new building, and what have you. And as I explained how all of this was land and we were going to do this interstate highway connection between 93 and 95, and that all along Tremont Street, Columbus Avenue used to be housing. And the only housing that's left out there that wasn't torn down through urban renewal / removal was public housing. And one of the freshmen, you know, said to me, well, were they going to tear down public housing, or were they just going to run the highway through here? And as I thought about it, the reality was that they were really just going to run the highway through there, because they tore down private housing, took it by eminent domain. But there is Lenox Camden, Alice Taylor Haywood, Mission Hill, Whittier Street, and on down, you know, the Bromley Heath and what have you. I mean, so that speaks to the issues relative to structural racism. And I immediately thought about the research going on at Tufts and the near highway study that's looking at the rates of asthma of kids that live close to interstate highways. You know, but I had never seen it that way. So when you talk about viewing it from a different lens, I mean, that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. You know, so I have to go back and find out whether there was ever a plan to move the public housing, but I assume not.
Did we have a question in this corner?
Yeah, hi. I was just wondering if there are signs of light in the medical or the broader community, and what are they?
Signs of light?
Yeah, progress, like movement forward, possibility for future positive action and continuous growth.
I'm a cynic relative to the medical establishment. You know, I'm anti, quote unquote, health reform. I was anti Massachusetts. I was anti the model that they adopted for the country, because the bottom line is we have a system that is broken, that does not work for the majority of people, and the amount of money that we spend in medical care is unconscionable relative to what our outcomes are. I mean, we are, you know, among the worst of the developed countries relative to health care. And I think that the tyranny of professionals and the seduction of technology, which is the panacea of biomedical, you know, research, interventions in our country. You know, we see people talking about we have the best medical system in the world. Well, we have the best medical system in the world if, in fact, you want to perpetuate people's lives, regardless as to the quality of that life. If you want to spend a lot of money on interventions and the like. You know, I was sharing with people today that, you know, I suffer a disability from my first encounter with the medical system in a serious way. In that, you know, I was going for a diagnostic procedure to find out something that was on my heart, just something. They didn't even know what it was. And in the course of that, they severed the nerve to my vocal cord. If people knew how many medical mistakes happen in our hospitals, you know, I mean, serious medical errors, in addition to the kinds of infections that people get, I mean, they would stay as far away from the medical system as possible. I think that the light is that we move towards being a healthier country, all right, that we impact on people's behaviors relative to things that make them unhealthy, and try to stay as far away from the medical system as we possibly can.
I would, just the place for me is I'm seeing more younger people who have an understanding of racism that I didn't get till I was in my early 40s. And I think that that's and I'm not in any way saying, I don't, you know, there's a different, I think that the reality of interpersonal race reaction has changed, but systemic racism, that's not impacting systemic racism. So I want to be really clear about that. But I am seeing more and more people. I'm seeing things, you know, the white privilege conference just ended. It's 11th year, and 2,000 people show up for that, you know, and every one of them knows. So I'm seeing shifts in that way. You know, what's interesting, as we've been talking here, I'm thinking of the title, Healing the Angry Heart. And that's, I think, a great metaphor for what our country needs to do. You know, Horace Seldon, our founder, always talked about that the nation was founded on a horrible contradiction. On the one hand, all quote-unquote men are created equal, and on the other hand, clearly white property men are a lot more equal. And we have not, and he talked about that contradiction being a struggle for the soul of the nation, and we have not yet confronted that struggle. You know, Donna Bivens and Horace Smaller at the Union of Minority Neighborhoods in Boston have a project going where they're doing a truth and reconciliation process around desegregation and busing in Boston, and we need to do that as a nation. And I think until we, you know, James Baldwin said people who look like me, are trapped in a history that they don't understand, and until they can confront that history, they can never be freed from it. And I think for me, that's why we need to heal the angry heart of this country.
Listening to this conversation tonight, it feels to me that so many things are going the wrong way. You know, we feel like gaps are widening, people are struggling more, et cetera. So I'm feeling that, but on the other hand, I'm also feeling the fact that 10 years ago, when I saw this documentary, people were still arguing about whether there were health disparities and whether racism even existed and whether it even impacted healthcare. And I know that there's been a lot of money and attention and resources put on the problem. I won't say thrown at the problem, but I'll say put on the problem. And, you know, for those of us who've been doing this a long time, we see a lot of missteps, but I think that's how progress works. You know, I'd like to think, you know, I don't think it's 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but over 10 years, I see the fact that, as you're saying, people are talking about it, people are understanding it, we haven't figured it out yet. As Gonja asked, you know, what are some solutions? We're, as a nation, as a humanity, we're trying to figure these things out. And as a perpetual optimist, you can't do this work. I know you've got that in you, Elmer, or else you wouldn't be still doing this work. We have to believe that we're going to figure it out at some point, and hopefully, you know, sooner rather than later.
This was a terrific discussion. I want to thank the Belmont Against Racism, who helped support this. We would not have been able to have this event without them, and I thank you very much. And I want to thank the Belmont Media Center. This is a wonderful facility. We're so lucky to be able to use this here. The Spirited Gourmet in Cushing Square supplied the wine for our event. I want to thank them as well. And I think that this was a terrific event. I hope that we can have more events like this. As I said before, this is to kick off the start of production of my new film, excuse me, Healing the Angry Heart. We are at the beginning stages. We're fundraising. There are opportunities to make tax-deductible donations to help us make the film. If anybody would like to talk with me about that or visit the website, jfedigan.com, it's all on the handouts that I gave everyone. I would appreciate any sort of feedback or anything. And, you know, let's adjourn to the other room, and there's some more food there and something to eat. And thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.